Mentation, as well as the possibility of conscious active manifestation, can arise in beings from various associations, and from the time when their separate brains, associating now quite independently, begin engendering in one and the same common presence three differently sourced being impulses, they then, thanks to this, gradually, as it were, acquire in themselves three personalities, having nothing in common with each other in respect of needs and interests. Rather more than half of all the anomalies arising in the general psyche of your favorites, particularly those of recent times, are due in the first place to their having in their entire presence a process of three different kinds of independent associations, evoking in them the being impulses of three localizations of different kinds and of different properties. And secondly, because there is a connection between these three separate localizations in them, as there is also in general in the presence of every kind of three-brained being predetermined by great nature for other what are called common presence functionings. And thirdly, because from everything perceived and sensed, that is, from every kind of shock, associations of three different kinds of impressions proceed in the three said localizations, in consequence of which three totally different kinds of being impulses are evoked in one and the same whole presence. Then, on account of all this, a number of experiencings are nearly always proceeding in them at one and the same time, and each of these experiencings by itself evokes in the whole of their being an inclination for a corresponding manifestation, and in accordance with the definite parts of their total presence, a corresponding movement is thus actualized. Just these said different sourced associative experiencings proceed in their common presences and ensue one from the other also in accordance with the same law of sevenfoldness. The learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legomenism, belonging to this group then in Babylon, indicated what they wished in the movements and in the actions of the participants in the mysteries in the following way. For instance, suppose that in order to fulfill his role in the given mystery, according to lawful associations, a participant evoked in one or another of his brains some new impression or other. He was bound to react by some or other definite manifestation or movement. But he would intentionally produce this manifestation or movement, not as he ought to have produced it according to the law of sevenfoldness, but otherwise. And in these otherwises they inserted in a certain way whatever they considered necessary for transmission to distant generations. In order, my boy, that you should have a concrete representation of these Saturday demonstrations, at which I was always glad to be present, in order to rest from my intense activities at that time, I will give you an illustrative example of how these learned mysterists demonstrated before the other learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legomenism various being experiencings and manifestations according to the flow of associations, from among the number of which fragments for future mysteries were selected. For these demonstrations, they constructed in one of the large halls of the club a specially raised place, which they then called the reflector of reality. But beings of subsequent epochs to whom the information concerning these Babylonian learned mysterists chanced to be transmitted, and who began imitating them, and doing as it were the same, called and still call their constructions of a similar kind stages. Well then, two of the participants would always come upon these reflectors of reality or stages first, and then usually one of them stood for a while and, as it were, listened to his own what is called Darthellusnian state, or, as it is sometimes otherwise said, to the state of his own inner associative general psychic experiencings. Listening in this way, he would make it clear to his reason, for instance, that the sum total of his associating experiencings emerged in the form of an urgent inclination to hit another being in the face, the sight of whom had always served as the cause for the beginning of the association of those series of impressions present in him, which had always evoked in his general psyche disagreeable experiencings, offensive to his own self-consciousness. Let us suppose that these disagreeable experiencings always proceeded in him when he saw someone who was then called Iradohahon, which professional their contemporary beings now call a policeman. Having then made this Darthellusnian psychic state an inclination of his clear to his reason, but at the same time being, on the one hand, well aware that in the existing conditions of external social existence, it was impossible for him to gratify his inclination to the full, and on the other hand, being already perfected by reason, and being well aware of his dependence on the automatic functioning of the other parts of his common presence, he clearly understands that on the gratification of this inclination of his depends the fulfillment of some imminent and important being duty of his, of great importance to those around him. And having thought over everything in this way, he decides to gratify this urgent inclination of his as best he can by at least doing a moral injury to that Iradohahon, by evoking in him associations that would lead to unpleasant experiencings. With this object in view, he turns to the other learned being who has come onto the stage with him, and treating him now as an Iradohahon, or policeman, he would say, "Hi, you! Don't you know your duty? Don't you see that there," pointing with his hand at that moment in the direction of another small room of the club where were the other participants of the demonstrations of that day, two citizens, a soldier and a cobbler, are fighting in the street and disturbing the public peace, and here you are leisurely strolling about, imagining yourself God knows who, and leering at the passing wives of honest and respectable citizens. Just you wait, you scamp. Through my chief, the city's chief physician, I shall report to your chief your negligence and breach of duty." From that moment, the learned being who had spoken would become a physician, because he had chanced to call his chief the head physician of the city, while the second learned being, whom the former had called a policeman, would assume the role of a policeman. Two other participating learned beings were then immediately called from the other room by the one who assumed the role of policeman, and they assumed the roles of cobbler and soldier, respectively. And these two latter learned beings assumed and had to manifest themselves in just those roles, namely one in the role of a soldier and the other in the role of a cobbler, only because the first learned being, who, having himself in accordance with his Darthellusnian state, assumed the role of a physician, had called them soldier and cobbler respectively. Well then, these three learned beings, who were thus cast impromptu by the fourth learned being for fulfilling every kind of perception and manifestation, which had to flow by law of types foreign to them, or, as your favorites say, of strange roles, namely of the roles of cobbler, soldier, and policeman, further produced their experience